What happens when a fallen hero is treated like baggage at an airport? It's a moment that will leave you speechless. A soldier who gave his life for his country was about to be disrespected in a way no one could have imagined. But one man refused to let it happen. This is the story of how one Marine stood up to the system and reminded the world what honor truly means. The airport terminal hummed with its usual energy. The soft clatter of rolling luggage, the distant buzz of flight announcements, and the murmur of hurried conversations filled the air. Travelers were focused on their own schedules, moving in every direction, heading to gates, making their final checks, and rushing to catch their flights. Amidst all of this chaos, there was one individual who stood out like a beacon of purpose and solemnity. Sergeant Major Williams stood near the entrance of the gate, dressed in his Marine Corps uniform, the dark blue fabric of his coat adorned with the gold insignia of his rank. His uniform, with its sharp edges and impeccable fit, was a testament to years of service, of dedication to a life of duty. His chest was decorated with medals, each one representing a chapter in his long and storied career achievements that spoke of courage, sacrifice, and commitment to his country. However, despite his many honors, today was not about him. His face, usually stern but with a glimmer of pride, now wore a somber expression, weighed down by the gravity of the task before him. His eyes were focused, but there was an unmistakable sadness in them. The air around him seemed to be thicker, more oppressive, as if the very walls of the terminal understood the significance of the moment. Sergeant Major Williams was not merely traveling as a soldier today. He was an escort, the guardian of a fallen comrade, tasked with bringing the body of Private Mark Thompson back home, where it belonged. It was a duty that required no explanation to any soldier, but to an outsider, it would likely be incomprehensible. The fallen hero had given his life for his country, and this was his final journey, the one that would bring him home, to be laid to rest with the dignity and honor he deserved. Williams had been in the military for over 20 years. He had seen it all: battles fought, lives lost, and moments of victory that would forever be etched in the hearts of those who survived. He had learned the values of discipline, sacrifice, and what it meant to live a life devoted to a cause greater than oneself. But none of those experiences had prepared him for the weight of this task. It wasn't just the job of transporting a casket. It wasn't even about getting the soldier home. It was about honoring that soldier, ensuring that the life of Private Thompson, his sacrifice, was never forgotten. This mission, Williams knew, was the last act of service that Private Thompson would ever receive. For Sergeant Major Williams, this was a sacred responsibility. As he stood by the flag-draped casket of Private Mark Thompson, his mind was a swirl of thoughts. He thought about the young man who had been just 22 years old, full of dreams, hopes, and a future that had been cut short. Private Thompson had enlisted in the military right out of high school, eager to serve his country, to be part of something larger than himself. His family had been proud of his decision, even though they knew it meant he might not come back. Now, Sergeant Major Williams found himself standing in front of that very casket. Private Thompson's body was wrapped in the American flag, a symbol of the price of freedom. The weight of the flag-draped coffin was more than just the physical burden it carried. It was symbolic of the deep cost of war, the sacrifices made by soldiers, and the void left behind in the lives of those who loved them. The young soldier was now nothing more than a name on a memorial, a name engraved on a plaque, but for those who had known him, he was a son, a brother, a friend, a life that was now lost. Sergeant Major Williams couldn't help but reflect on the life that Private Thompson had led. In the time that they had served together, Williams had seen the younger man grow from a nervous recruit into a confident and capable soldier. They had shared stories, laughed over meals, and braved the hardships of their training side by side. They had been through the fires of combat together, each looking out for the other, knowing that the bond between soldiers ran deeper than anything most people could ever understand. They were brothers in arms, bound by duty and loyalty. Now that bond had become a solemn responsibility. This was not just a mission to transport a body. It was a mission to honor a life that had been lost in the service of a country that would never fully be able to repay the debt owed to soldiers like Private Thompson. The casket that stood before him was not just a lifeless container of a body. It was a reminder of the sacrifices made every day by men and women in uniform. Williams knew that his role in bringing this soldier home was one that would haunt him, but also one that would give him a sense of fulfillment that no medal or rank could provide. As the airport continued to hum around him, with the usual chaos of travelers, Williams felt a sense of isolation. He wasn't just another passenger waiting for a flight. He was carrying something sacred, something that demanded respect. He had witnessed the brutality of war, the pain of losing comrades, and the anger that came with the questions of why so many had to die. But in that moment, as he stood by Private Thompson's casket, it wasn't about the violence or the politics of war. It was about honoring a soldier who had given everything for the cause of freedom. Williams stood there, quietly, his eyes fixed on the casket, reflecting on the immense responsibility that now lay on his shoulders. The final chapter of Private Thompson's journey was about to begin, and it would be Williams' honor to carry him home, where his family could finally say goodbye, and where the fallen soldier would rest, remembered by those who had never forgotten his sacrifice. Sergeant Major Williams had been anticipating this moment for months. The journey he was about to take was one he never wished for, but it was a duty he had promised to fulfill. He had followed every protocol, completed all necessary paperwork, and ensured that the chain of command had everything in place for the journey. From the military base overseas, where Private Thompson had been laid to rest, all the way to the airport, Williams knew his mission. It was simple: transport the fallen soldier home with the honor and respect he deserved. There were no deviations in the plan, and everything was arranged to ensure that this final journey would be smooth. But as the trio Williams, the casket, and the officer accompanying him approached the check-in counter, the situation took an unexpected and unsettling turn. The check-in area, a bustling hub of travelers waiting to board their flights, suddenly seemed quieter as Williams moved toward the counter. His steps were measured and deliberate, as if he could already feel the weight of the moment. The casket, carefully draped in the American flag, was gently placed beside him on a small cart, the symbol of sacrifice and bravery. The staff behind the counter had been informed in advance of the nature of the flight, so there should have been no surprises. Yet, as they reached the front of the line, the unexpected occurred. A young airline worker, probably no older than 25, stepped forward with a clipboard in hand. Her eyes quickly scanned the details in front of her, and then her gaze fell to the casket. She hesitated for only a moment before addressing Williams with a polite but businesslike tone, typical of someone used to handling the complexities of airline travel. "I'm sorry, sir, but we'll need to process the extra baggage fees for this," she said, nodding toward the casket. Williams stood frozen, the words barely registering in his mind. Extra baggage? He had heard her right, hadn't he? The young woman was referring to the fallen soldier Private Thompson, not as a hero, but as extra baggage. His heart sank, and a rush of disbelief washed over him. Extra baggage? Williams repeated, his voice laced with a mix of confusion and rising anger. "This isn't just any baggage. This is a fallen soldier. This man gave his life for this country. And this is how we honor him." The young worker, undeterred, stuck to the script. "I understand, sir, but I have to follow company policy. The casket is an additional item, and it needs to be processed accordingly. There are extra fees involved." Williams' military training kicked in instantly. He knew how to handle tense situations, how to de-escalate conflicts, but this was different. This wasn't just about adhering to procedure. It was about something much deeper, something far more significant than airline protocol. The casket before him represented the sacrifice of a life, a young man who had given everything for his country. It wasn't just extra baggage. It was a soldier's final journey, a sacred responsibility. Around them, other passengers began to notice the exchange. Their footsteps slowed as they overheard the conversation. Some passengers glanced nervously, sensing that something wasn't right, but few dared to speak up. Williams could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. They were waiting to see what would happen next, perhaps unsure of what they should do in a moment like this. He could hear the murmurs, the occasional gasp from someone who had just caught the gravity of the situation. The young airline worker remained firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but unless we process the fees, I can't check the casket in. You'll need to take care of the charges." The air grew heavier, thick with tension. Williams took a step closer to the counter, his hands clenched at his sides, trying to hold on to his composure. He had spent years in the military, facing life-threatening situations and acting under pressure. Yet nothing had prepared him for this. He was accustomed to following orders, to making difficult decisions in moments of crisis, but here he was, confronted with an unimaginable lack of understanding. His country's honor was being questioned, not by an enemy soldier, but by an airline employee, simply doing her job. "It's not about the money," Williams said, his voice calm but firm, betraying none of the anger building inside. "This is a matter of respect. This soldier gave his life for this country, and you're asking me to pay for that? To pay for this final journey?" The young woman seemed to falter, her gaze momentarily shifting away, as though she was reconsidering her words. She was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but her hands remained on the counter, poised to continue with the procedure. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted from casual disinterest to an uncomfortable tension. A few people had stopped, talking entirely, waiting for the confrontation to unfold. Some onlookers, sensing the seriousness of the issue, began to edge closer, though none spoke up. There was something almost sacred about the way the crowd silently acknowledged what was happening. This was not just any argument, it was about the ultimate respect for a fallen soldier, and everyone in the vicinity knew it. Williams took a deep breath. He wasn't going to let this stand. He couldn't. It wasn't just about protocol anymore. It was about something that transcended all the trivial rules of the airline industry. It was about giving Private Thompson the dignity he had earned through his sacrifice, and making sure that those around him knew that some things, some moments, were too important to be reduced to mere policy. The seconds seemed to stretch on, but Williams remained composed. He wasn't just defending Private Thompson. He was standing up for every soldier who had ever given their life for their country. And at that moment, he knew it was a fight worth having. The tension in the air could be cut with a knife. Williams stood firmly at the counter, his eyes never leaving the young airline workers. He tried to remain calm, though every fiber of his being screamed to take action. This wasn't the confrontation he had expected, not in this moment, and certainly not when he was carrying out a duty so sacred. But as the minutes stretched on and the tension in the air thickened, he knew that he had to handle this with the utmost composure. "This man gave his life for this country," Williams said, his voice steady but firm, a quiet strength behind every word. "You can't treat him like ordinary luggage. His family deserves to see him come home with dignity. You don't charge someone for the honor of bringing their loved one back home." His words hung in the air, but the young airline worker seemed unmoved. Her expression was unreadable, as if she had heard similar complaints countless times before. With a calm demeanor, she responded, almost too mechanically, as though she were reciting rehearsed lines. "I'm just following procedure, sir. If you want a board, I'll need to check the extra fee for the casket. It's company policy." Williams felt a wave of frustration bubble up, but he swallowed it down. He had served under fire, faced hostile situations, and seen the worst of human nature. But this was different. This was a mistake of the deepest kind, one born of ignorance, bureaucracy, and an utter lack of respect. The young woman, in her defense, was simply doing her job, but that didn't make the situation any less infuriating. Around them, the people in line began to notice the escalating situation. The usual noise of the terminal seemed to fade into the background as an uncomfortable silence took its place. People were starting to whisper, some casting curious glances at Williams, who stood resolutely, unmoving, by the casket. The flag that draped the soldier's final resting place appeared to flutter slightly in the faint draft from the terminal's air conditioning, as if it too understood the weight of the moment. Williams continued, his voice never rising but full of quiet resolve. "I don't care about your company policy. What I care about is making sure this man is treated with the respect he earned. This soldier isn't luggage. This soldier gave everything for his country, and now you're telling me that I need to pay extra for him to be honored? That's not how we do things. That's not how we honor our fallen." The young worker's gaze faltered for a moment, as if she was about to reconsider. But before she could speak, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching. Another employee, a senior officer, walked into view. He was older, in his 40s perhaps, and he carried the air of someone who had seen many such situations in his time. His eyes quickly scanned the scene, noticing William's rigid stance and the casket beside him. There was a flicker of concern in his gaze, but also a sense of authority. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of authority. That immediately caught the attention of everyone around. Williams turned to face the new figure, his shoulders squared. He wasn't going to let this moment pass by without being heard. "Yes, there's a problem," he said, his voice unwavering. "This is not just some luggage. We are transporting a fallen soldier, and this man deserves respect. We're not paying any fees for this casket. His life meant more than a ticket." The senior officer's brow furrowed as he processed Williams' words. There was a long pause, a beat of hesitation where the officer appeared to be weighing his response. He glanced at the young worker, who looked visibly uncomfortable, her hands still poised over the computer screen, unsure of what to do next. The officer's eyes flicked back to Williams, studying him carefully. The situation was quickly spiraling beyond the realm of routine procedure, and into something much deeper, a a matter of respect, honor, and human decency. For a moment, it seemed like the officer might side with the worker. But then something remarkable happened. The officer's demeanor shifted. He took a step closer to the counter, his posture now more relaxed, yet filled with authority. The tension in the air was thick, and Williams could see the senior officer's internal struggle. Perhaps the officer had never encountered a situation like this before, where protocol and humanity collided so sharply. The officer let out a slow breath and then spoke, his voice quieter, more measured. "You're right," he said, surprising Williams and those within earshot. "This is not just luggage. This is a soldier, and he deserves respect. Let me handle this." He turned to the young worker, who seemed to have expected further resistance. "You can void the charges for the casket," the officer instructed, his voice now steady with the confidence of someone who knew this was the right thing to do. For a brief moment, the younger worker hesitated, looking at her superior as though she was unsure how to proceed. But as the senior officer's words sank in, she relented. With a sigh, she clicked a few buttons on her terminal, the screen flashing as the charges were removed from the system. Williams could feel a weight lift from his shoulders, but the moment was bittersweet. It wasn't just about getting the casket checked in without extra fees, it was about ensuring that Private Thompson was treated with the dignity and respect he had earned. The senior officer had made the right decision, but it hadn't been easy. As the situation slowly began to resolve, a silence fell over the small crowd that had gathered. Some passengers, now aware of what had transpired, nodded their approval, while others merely stood still, caught in the gravity of the moment. There were no more words exchanged, but the air had shifted. The respect that had been demanded in that moment had been granted, and Private Thompson's journey home could continue unimpeded by bureaucracy and restored with honor. The senior officer, his expression grave and resolute, turned toward the younger employee. He could see the tension hanging in the air and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. It was clear that this wasn't just a dispute over airline policy, it was something far more significant. The young worker had been following the rules, but those rules had failed to account for one very important thing, the human element. "You're mistaken," the senior officer said, his voice firm, but with an undeniable air of authority. "This isn't an extra charge. This is a man who gave everything for this country, and he deserves our full respect. Get the paperwork for this immediately, and make sure this is handled properly." The commanding tone of the senior officer left no room for further debate. The younger employee's eyes widened, and without a word, she quickly began to input the necessary information into her system. It was a stark contrast to the uncertainty that had filled the air just moments before. The calm authority that the officer had brought to the situation immediately began to ease the tension. Williams, standing tall beside the casket, felt a small sense of relief wash over him as the situation started to shift. But despite the words spoken and the impending resolution, the moment was far from over. The quiet, humdrum noise of the terminal had transformed into something more. An unspoken understanding had spread like wildfire. Passengers who had been merely passing through had begun to gather, drawn in by the unmistakable energy of the scene unfolding. They stood a few feet away, their eyes darting between the officer and Williams, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. Some travelers stood with their arms crossed, nodding their heads in silent approval as they saw the senior officer take charge. There was a quiet acknowledgement in the air that this was not just a situation about policy or fees anymore. It was about respect, about human decency, and about honoring someone who had made the ultimate sacrifice. A few people, particularly those who had military experience or had lost loved ones in combat, understood the weight of the moment all too well. Others, though, whispered in disbelief. Their voices carried an undertone of confusion, and they exchanged glances with one another. They couldn't fathom how something as simple as the return of a fallen soldier could be caught up in a misunderstanding over a fee. The reality of what was happening was starting to sink in. The incident had escalated quickly, and it was becoming clear that this was more than just an awkward exchange between a soldier and an airline employee. It was a glaring oversight of basic human respect. But amidst the whispers and murmurs, one figure in the crowd stood out, a man who had been watching the exchange from a distance. He was older than most of the others, wearing a faded jacket that indicated he had been through his own share of military service. There was a certain posture to him, something in his bearing that made it clear he had seen battle, had stood guard in the toughest of situations. He wasn't just another bystander, he was a veteran. His eyes locked on the scene before him, and it was evident that the airline's blunder had hit him much harder than the others. The older man stepped forward slowly, his footsteps deliberate and steady. He had lived through the same challenges that soldiers like Private Thompson had faced, and he knew what it meant to be overlooked, misunderstood, and mistreated. This was more than just about a fee. To him, this was a moment of reckoning. The veteran's gaze flicked toward the senior officer, and then he turned to face the young airline worker. He could see the young woman's face flush with embarrassment as she worked to correct her mistake, but he also saw something else, something deeper. She was following orders, yes, but the mistake wasn't just hers to bear. It was systemic. It was a lack of understanding, a failure to recognize the humanity behind the policies. He had seen it all too often, and in that moment, he knew he had to speak up. "Excuse me." The older man's voice cut through the hushed atmosphere, drawing the attention of those who had gathered. The senior officer, hearing the interruption, turned toward the veteran. The older man didn't wait for an invitation to speak. "I just want to say this," he began, his voice strong, steady, and laced with experience. "This is a mistake, and it's not just about the fee. You don't treat a fallen hero like this. You don't reduce their life to a charge or a baggage tag." His voice was tinged with a sharp, poignant truth that reverberated through the terminal. Williams, standing beside the casket, felt his chest tighten. He wasn't alone in his anger anymore. The support of this stranger, this fellow veteran, was a silent acknowledgement that what had happened here was more than just a misunderstanding. It was an injustice that needed to be corrected, one way or another. The senior officer nodded, a sense of solemn understanding passing between him and the veteran. There was a shared bond in that moment, an unspoken connection that only those who had served in the military could fully comprehend. As the veteran's words hung in the air, a ripple of recognition spread throughout the terminal. The passengers, who had remained passive up until now, began to murmur amongst themselves, sharing a quiet agreement. The mistake made by the airline staff wasn't going unnoticed. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a stark reminder that small actions, when driven by a lack of empathy, could lead to big consequences. The senior officer, now fully aware of the larger implications of the situation, made sure the process was corrected without further delay. The fees were removed, and the paperwork was finalized quickly. But for Williams, and for everyone who had witnessed the exchange, the true resolution was much more than just the cancellation of fees. It was the realization that sometimes mistakes like this are only corrected when those who understand the gravity of the situation speak up. And that was exactly what had happened here. What started as a simple mistake, a misunderstanding over fees, had turned into something much bigger. It had become a powerful reminder that respect for a fallen soldier cannot be diminished by bureaucracy. And as word spread throughout the terminal, it became clear that this moment would echo far beyond the walls of the airport. As the tension in the terminal began to ease, and the senior officer took the necessary steps to resolve the situation, something more profound was already unfolding. While the airline staff scrambled to correct their error, processing the paperwork and ensuring that the fallen soldier's remains would be treated with the dignity he deserved, a quiet form of heroism had already taken place. The passengers, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, began to understand the gravity of what had occurred. It was no longer just about fees, policies, or even the airline's mistake. It was about respect, humanity, and the sacrifice of a fallen soldier. The casket, once caught in the crossfire of bureaucratic oversight, was now being escorted through the terminal with the honor it had been due from the beginning. The American flag that draped the casket fluttered slightly, caught in the faint air currents of the terminal, as a few service members from the airline, along with Sergeant Major Williams, guided the soldiers' remains toward the boarding area. As they passed through the terminal, something remarkable began to happen. Passengers who had been milling about or sitting idly in their seats began to take notice. At first, there were a few quiet nods of acknowledgement, then whispers of respect. It didn't take long before the ripple of admiration turned into something far more powerful: applause. One by one, passengers stood and clapped. Some simply wiped their eyes, touched by the solemnity of the moment, while others clapped with growing intensity. It wasn't just a reaction to the mistake that had been corrected. It was a tribute to the fallen soldier, and just as importantly, to the Marine who had stood his ground. The very man who had insisted that a fallen hero would not be treated like cargo was now the center of that respect. Sergeant Major Williams stood tall, his expression solemn, but with a quiet sense of pride. He wasn't a man who sought attention or accolades, but in that moment, he knew that his actions had made a difference. His role in this situation had gone far beyond what was written on the official orders. He had ensured that Private Thompson, who had given everything for his country, was not forgotten, not lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy, but honored properly. The applause that rippled through the terminal wasn't just for the fallen soldier. It was a recognition of the values that Williams had upheld and the dignity he had fought to restore. As the airline staff continued to make apologies, offering their sincere regrets for the misunderstanding, it was clear that their words couldn't undo the damage that had been done. They apologized to Williams, to the passengers, and to anyone who had been affected by the oversight. But the problem wasn't just a simple mix-up. The incident had exposed a flaw in the system, one that had allowed a hero to be treated like mere luggage. The airline, which had long been known for its impeccable service, had missed the mark on something far more important than customer service. They had forgotten the basic principles of honor and respect, and no apology could take that away. This incident quickly made national news. Headlines across the country were flooded with the story of how an airline had initially treated the remains of a fallen soldier with indifference, and how a Marine had fought to make sure that didn't happen. The story of Private Thompson's final journey, though marred by an unfortunate and preventable mistake, became a powerful reminder of the sacrifice that soldiers like him made and of the deep respect they deserved. The airline faced public backlash as many questioned how such an oversight could have happened. People from all walks of life shared their outrage on social media, calling out the lack of awareness and respect shown in a moment of profound national importance. Yet, amid the controversy and the backlash, one thing remained clear. Private Thompson's journey home had been completed. He had come back to his country, back to the family and the land he had fought to protect, and he was finally at rest, surrounded by the honor he had earned. The initial mistake had only highlighted the deep respect that his fellow soldiers, and, by extension, the public held for him. In that sense, the incident was not a failure of the system, but rather an example of how people can rise above errors and ensure that what is truly important is upheld. The mistake, as big as it was, turned into a valuable lesson for everyone involved. It showed the immense power of standing up for what is right, even when the system doesn't understand or agree with it. Sergeant Major Williams had stood his ground not for the sake of defiance, but to protect the honor of a fallen soldier, and in doing so, he had demonstrated the true meaning of duty. He had reminded everyone watching that certain things, respect for life, for service, and for sacrifice, cannot be measured in fees or policies. These values transcend bureaucracy. And as for Private Thompson, his final journey ended in the way it should have from the very beginning. With the respect, dignity, and honor he had earned, he was finally home. While the circumstances surrounding his return had been far from perfect, they ultimately revealed the profound commitment of those who had known him, soldiers like Sergeant Major Williams, who fought not just on the battlefield, but in moments like these, where the honor of a fallen comrade was all that mattered. Private Thompson was home, where he belonged, and the story of his journey would serve as a reminder for years to come. Sometimes honor must be fought for, but when it is upheld, it changes everything. Private Thompson's journey home may have been marred by a mistake, but in the end, it was a story of redemption, respect, and the unbreakable bond that exists between those who serve. It's a reminder that the sacrifices made by our military deserve the highest level of honor, no matter the circumstances. What do you think about the airline's actions in this story? Do you believe that this was a simple mistake or something deeper? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the respect we owe to our heroes, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps us share more of these moments that remind us what truly matters in life. And as always, thank you for watching. Until next time, keep honoring those who serve and stay tuned for more incredible stories.